Okay, so we have a good number of folk joined already, so I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar on leading through a world of uncertainty. And it's a bit of an understatement to say that we have all been through quite a lot over the last few years, what with COVID affecting the global community. We're now recovering from that. Economic growth is faltering a bit. We have high inflation in certain areas. We're having to deal with long-term climate change. And of course, we've got the military conflict, which is affecting us in a number of ways. So against that background, how do we lead ourselves and our teams through such uncertainty? And we have a fantastic panel that I'm going to introduce very shortly who are going to debate that. Now, you can participate by asking questions through the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of the screen. The webinar will run for 50 minutes, and there will be a recording on our website. So if people have missed part of it, or if you want to send it on to contacts, please feel free to do so. So in terms of our panel today, we have Bill McCall, a very experienced board chair, corporate financier, and past president of the Chartered Banker Institute. We then have Dean Aloise, dad, musician, and you can see his guitars behind him. We may hear a song shortly, or may not. And Dean is also MD of Buck in the USA. Global HR consultancy. And finally, Marjorie Ngwenya, who is a qualified actuary, past president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, has held senior positions in financial services, and is currently on the Bank of England's Prudential Regulation Committee. And we're also delighted that Marjorie is an associate of Leading Figures. So it's a great panel. Many thanks for joining us. And I'm going to pass over to Thomas, who is going to lead us through the session, facilitate the conversation, and I'll see you towards the end. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Russell. You know, we're really delighted to be facilitating this conversation today with business acquaintances and friends in Bill, Dean, and Marjorie. Thanks so much for joining us. And you know what, we've launched this webinar on the same day that Elon Musk has just launched his Starship rocket. Now, I was watching it earlier. It was quite inspirational, actually. It did crash and burn eventually, but my understanding is that it did collect significant data and could, you know, herald the beginning of interplanetary travel. I mention that because we could even touch on space later. Back down here on Earth, this is a webinar today of two halves. The first half is going to be around exploring the impact of some of the global issues that Russell's just highlighted there, the impact of those issues on business as usual, if you will. And then the second half of the webinar, we're going to be focusing in on the skills that our panelists have drawn on over the years, really, to deal with and navigate uncertainty. In the meantime, as a prelude to this webinar, Bill, you very kindly offered to write an article for us. That article is entitled "Follow the Leader." It's been uploaded to the Leading Figures website, and it's there for anyone who wants to read it. But Bill, to set the scene for the conversation today, I'd be grateful if you could perhaps provide a summary of your article over the next few minutes. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Thomas. And it is a pleasure to be here. You'll be delighted to know I haven't changed my mind on any of the things that I've written in that piece. I think the space part that you just alluded to, just very briefly, there is a space dimension now coming along, and I do see that as a future area for development and conflict. But that's just an aside. The bigger picture macro piece globally that I've been looking at quite closely with colleagues is, where is it all going? And I'm concluding that change is the only constant, which is the old adage, and change is driven by competition, demographics, and technology. The fact that they are all present, competition being inevitable in life. As soon as something looks profitable, it will drive competition towards it. Demographics, that I touch on the piece, there are now 8 billion of us living on this planet. Hard to believe that only a century or so ago it was 2 billion, and that number is forever going up. Now, there are demographic economists who've got multiple different views. The point here is, in the Western developed world, we have an aging population, and that's something I'll come back to in a moment or two. And then also, one of the accelerators or catalysts to change is technology. The arrival of railroads way back in the 1800s was leading edge technology, very closely followed by wire technology, communications down the wire. We are now in a point where this webinar can be around the world faster than you can recite one line of Shakespeare. And that is reflective of the communication world that we live in. However, we all recognize that during the pandemic, the global supply chain was under severe pressure, and we could see where breakages in that supply chain would lead to. So the 3 big P's that we look at: population, the inevitability of the aging population. And for those in the Western developed world, you need only look at Japan to see a fairly advanced case of more people exiting the workplace than coming into the workplace. And that gives rise to all sorts of social and medical related challenges of funding. And we are seeing that to a degree in the UK because of the National Health Service that we have here, which is quite a unique setting for delivering health at the point of delivery. So population is key. Productivity, long been an issue within the UK particularly, is going to be a specific point that most organizations and most national companies and countries are going to have to improve over the course of the next little while as well. And the 3rd P, points of difference. What is your differentiator? There is clearly evidence over many centuries that those who can stand taller than most in terms of their expertise, their ability to deliver, or whatever it may be, will win. So a point of difference allows you to step out from just the noise of the mass to deliver something that allows you to create value for clients rather than just simply delivering things for clients. And the final point on it, I suppose, is that carbon, climate, food, de-dollarization, the polarized energy strategies of various blocs in the world, we've started to see a real emergence of hot war from cold war to something in between. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon. We may look at the period from the mid-90s through to now as having, in fact, been relatively benign, even though there was all sorts going on globally with terrorism and everything else. We may now be entering into a real hot war, cold war phase as the various polarized groups with their different views of democracy or closed societies or whatever it may be begin to start to align with each other. And the great game that Lord Palmerston talked about in the 1890s is back. So the great game now looks as though this is China and its acolytes and the US and its allies, and never the twain shall meet. And if there's a containment strategy for China, that will be bad news. And it will be very interesting to see where all of that geopolitical strife goes. Now, as a much younger version of me, board games were a thing about 40 odd years ago, maybe even longer. And there used to be a board game called Risk. And I fear that we are living a real-time version of the board game Risk right now.
Thank you, Bill. Well said. And Marjorie, if I could turn to you, obviously, Russell was highlighting your career there. I just wonder when Bill was sharing his thoughts, what was coming up for you there, Marjorie?
Thanks, Thomas. So I think that navigating this world requires a degree of ease with change, and that really came through strongly in Bill's paper. Being adaptable, embracing fluctuations, being open to new ideas and experiences. My career has involved a lot of voluntary change, roles, organizations, geographies, and I've also had to adapt to external changes, so learning to be flexible as the world changes around me. Most recently, the geopolitical environment has been quite unsettling, and it's really difficult to make sense of what all the changes mean in isolation, let alone put together. And in a UK context in particular, there have been many so-called shocks to the economic and political environment that they almost seem like the norm. I've had to really plug into the media and try to understand what all of these changes mean for the many people that they affect and for the work that I do. On a personal note, I think for many of us, the pandemic was unexpected and very unsettling. And I certainly had to redesign life as a result of the world shutting down borders and access. Spending those first few months in isolation was therapeutic to begin with, but after a few months, the solitude took its toll on me. And being an introvert, I'm really quite comfortable with my own company, but I wasn't expecting that it would wear on for quite so long. And in the end, I decided to become a digital nomad and to work from various locations around the world for my sanity, to be around people and to take full advantage of the fact that I didn't have to be in any one place. There was a very strong theme around mental health that was echoed in many circles. And it reminds me of the serenity prayer, which says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think maintaining sanity in a changing world requires a level of peace with what's beyond our control and the motivation and courage to change that which we can. And then lastly, in a commercial sense, the points of difference that Bill referred to, I think, are exploited through careful listening. Consumer behaviors have also evolved over time with the emergence of technology and the rapid changes all around us. So just being aware of what these changes are and making mindful choices about how best to take them into consideration is important, I think, for competitive positioning. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Marjorie. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points. If I could just move to yourself, Dean, as Buck's US Managing Director, you're mindful of what Bill was saying there, and then Marjorie adding her thoughts. What really has kept you awake at night, Dean, or taken up your headspace over these past few years relative to the global issues?
Yeah, it's a great question, Thomas, and Bill and Marjorie, you really covered so many things. And as you were talking, my head was just spinning with, wow, we've really been through a lot over the past 4 years. And, from the vantage point of an HR consultant, we deal with employers, thousands of employers across the globe. And so have insight into how all of these changes are impacting millions of employees and how those employees are feeling and what those employees now need and expect from their employers. So all of the things that Bill and Marjorie covered sort of all culminate into a vastly different set of expectations that we see employees now requiring of their employment contract with their employers. And specifically, it gets back to, there's a notion of total rewards. That's how employers traditionally engaged with or paid their people. And for many, many years, it was simply pay and benefits. It was simply their compensation and maybe their retirement and their health plans. And for a long time, that was adequate. That's all that was required to be put in an offer letter. But what we've really seen galvanize over the last 4 years, especially, is this notion of it's not just total rewards anymore. It's not adequate. It's about a total experience. Employees are feeling so many things and going through so many things. They're looking for a total experience, and they're expecting their employer to provide that. So these are things in addition to pay and benefits, things such as community, purpose, inclusivity, a need for authenticity from their leadership teams, and getting back to some of the pay and benefits, not just just your typical pay and benefits, but are those pay and benefits, are they able to be resilient? Are they able to provide not just a paycheck every month, but can it provide stability through uncertain times? Can it provide surety that things can withstand the next pandemic? So the expectation just has gone through the roof for employers, and employees are sometimes they have nowhere else to look.
Yeah, again, well said, Dean. And Bill, if I could come back to you, just listening to Dean and Marjorie's comments there. Obviously, you yourself, you're a corporate financier. You've held many roles. You've been involved in numerous, businesses and business transactions. And it was one of the things that, the last time Russell and I met up with you, you made the point that business leaders do need to lift their heads from business as usual to do some horizon gazing. How important do you feel that is? Would you like to elaborate on that?
I conclude, Thomas, that there is no business as usual. I think it's business at the pace of change. And if you are simply doing the day job you're managing, you're not directing. And I think as leaders, there is a significant difference between leading and directing. The truism is, how can you tell a leader from others? And the leader has followers, is the point I make in the piece that I wrote for the website. I think also both Dean and Marjorie made the point about humility. I think authenticity is really important. I think beyond transactional relationships, which I think was a mark of the 80s, maybe 90s, and some sectors are very transactional. You do this, I do that, that's the end of it. I think what Dean said about employees and colleagues, they're now looking for much more than just a transactional paycheck in return for labor. They're looking for much more. And I think leaders have to demonstrate authenticity around their belief of what they're leading to or what they're leading from. And I think also humility and good grace are quite important. I hope the days of hubristic leaders have gone. I think we are seeing evidence of that across multiple sectors, whether it's trade bodies, the entertainment sector, the banking sector, whatever, that the days of hubristic dominant leaders who would simply shout louder to be heard, I'm hoping that those days are gone. I mean, the weak defense of that kind of behavior often is, I demand high standards, so of course I'm going to do that. I think there's a defense like that going around at the moment within political circles. I just don't see the credence in that at all. I think you have to inspire people by demonstrating and doing things you're asking them to do, that you would do them yourself, and you can or could do them yourself. And I think that ultimately leads to the follow me thing. So authenticity and also some empathy, not just saying how are things, but not listening. I think when you empathize and get to know your people, it ultimately leads to better things. Now, I have over the years extended gratitude and credit to people in terms of giving a bit more rope. And quite often you get disappointed because it happens in life, but that's not a reason not to do it. So I think from that perspective, I look at the UK military setup, which I have an interest in, and the motto of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst is not lost on me. It is serve to lead. It's about the servant leader as opposed to the hubristic, egotistical leader. It's the leader within that setting that eats last, that makes sure everybody is dealt with first. And to my mind, yeah, you may get the odd disappointment from people when you do that. They may use it against you. But I think more often than not, that leads to a relationship leadership rather than a transactional one, which I think is a relatively short runway to nowhere, ultimately. If you are simply a transactor, don't expect to have many friends and acquaintances.
Very good, Bill. Yeah, that's definitely a point that I think we should come back to. In the meantime, Dean, you had also mentioned authenticity there. Bill's reinforced that point. To what extent can you be authentic at work, do you think?
Yeah, that is it's another really important question, Thomas. And I think ultimately the answer is that you have to be authentic. It's just it's an imperative, and there are always so many forces that may pull you in different directions, and there's media forces and social forces and so many things pulling you in different directions. However, I think what helps someone be comfortably authentic is when you're also anchored in a set of values that you can stand behind. So I think that really, those two really kind of need to go together for you to be openly and happily authentic. Because if you first sort of need to lead yourself to the place where you're anchored in values that withstand the test of time. And those values, we're talking a lot about uncertainty and change in this discussion. And those values that you anchor yourself in are things that don't ever have to change. So that in and of itself can provide a lot of comfort and stability for the people that may be following you, or the organization that may be following you. So it's really, I think coming down to the value system that you're anchored in, and then the authenticity can come out of that. So I think that's kind of an important piece to get right first.
Very good, Dean. That really is an anchor. Marjorie, I see you nodding in agreement there with Dean. Dean mentioned there forces pulling us in different directions, and those values being the anchor. You said earlier, Marjorie, that you adapted throughout your career, and I just wonder, were there times when you left rather than adapted, so you were led by your values, as Dean's just described there?
Absolutely. There have been some difficult choices to make along the way. And I think Dean's absolutely right in needing to be clear about what that value set is, and then tuning in when you feel that it's been compromised. And it isn't always obvious. It might manifest as a kind of dis-ease within yourself around what's happening, what's being said, how you're being treated, how others are being treated, the direction of the organization. And if you're not paying attention, you can go along with that and start asking yourself questions around why you're feeling this way. And there've been at least 2 times that I can recall where I've had to really take stock of whether this was a good fit for me, and had to ask myself what I was willing to do to create change. And so in the first instance, I was vocal. I expressed my concerns and what I thought could be done differently, and made a proposal for a way forward. And in the end, I guess you have to make a call about whether things are moving in accordance with the way you'd like to see them happen, or whether it's going to be more of the same. And in other words, you need to step aside and let it be. So not easy, but important, I think.
Not easy, Marjorie, as you say. And how did those feelings manifest themselves, Marjorie? Did you have a feeling in the pit of your stomach? Were these thoughts? Was it head and heart? How did these feelings manifest themselves to the point of making a decision?
So in the first instance, I start to feel a little testy, and I have to ask myself, what is it? What's jarring with me?
Yeah.
And typically it's around justice. So something that's happening where a group of people is not being treated fairly, or it's about a culture where people are comfortable to say things behind people's backs, but not say them to them directly. And then we talk in circles, and I'm a fairly direct person. And so when things like that occur, I start to feel restless, I guess, and I have to check in with myself and ask what it is. But I also have physical manifestations. So I start to have headaches when something's really troubling me. And if I keep having a headache in the same situation over and over again, it's telling me something. And in at least one of those instances, I had to listen to what my body was physically trying to share and just take stock of what was happening and whether I felt that there were ways that I could manage that better. So deal with the mounting anxiety and not land myself in a place where I needed to leave. But ultimately, I think it was the best choice to do so.
Right, Marjorie, thanks ever so much for sharing that. Now, we're beginning to maybe draw on those skills. Just before we go there, I wonder if we could double back to this impact of global issues on everyday life and work. We have a poll that Russell's organised there. Russell, if I could hand over to you for that poll to hear what our guests have to say today. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm just going to launch this poll, which should come through now.
Great, that I can see that on screen. So to our guests, to what extent do you consider the impact of global issues on business or life?
Yeah.
And the answers are coming through.
Yeah. So I'm just going to end the poll. We've got most people and results have come through, which so the answer is very, frequently. To what extent do you consider the impact of global issues on business life? And it's pretty up there in people's minds.
Thanks, Russell. Bill, any comments on that? Is that a surprise?
Not hugely. I suppose the key issue for me is where in the world are you operating and in which sectors are you operating in?
Right.
I suppose if you're operating in a fast-moving environment, in a geopolitically sensitive place, you may have a different view about all of that. So I suppose if you're sitting in the Far East at the moment, you may have a different view about the South China Sea and the Pacific. And if you're sitting in Kyiv at the moment, or you're sitting in the Donbass region, you probably have a different view about the severity of change and the impact of change globally. If you're sitting in a more benign economy and you're sitting with 10% inflation and interest rates likely to rise in the UK, it might feel very different. However, it's all impacts of some description, and they're all relevant, hugely relevant to the way that we think. I was interested that all of that was pushing towards either frequently or often or sometimes, and we only have to look. I was rereading a book that was published in 2001. It's called Living on Thin Air, Charles Ledbetter. And I'll send the details, Thomas, so you can put those up later. And I did read this in 2001, and it's about economies that had no goods going around the world. It was all about services. And it's a new blueprint for the 21st century. And goodness me, I was rereading a little bit of this ahead of us getting together today. And some of it is just so pertinent about the change that we were facing 22 years ago now. And I think that's something that we simply have to pay attention to. The holistic company would be successful. Integration, the ability to integrate diverse skills, different knowledge, collaborative leadership styles would be important, etc., etc. All really interesting stuff, which all indicates that we have to be flexible. And the pace of change in most sectors is considerably faster than it was a decade ago.
Indeed, Bill, thank you for that. And Russell, just wondering, do we have a question through the Q&A there, do I see?
Yeah, we have a question from Reese, which is asking the panel if they've come across the concept of followership, and which my understanding is there's so much, we believe quite rightly, focus on leadership that sometimes maybe we don't really focus enough on the bulk of people in the organization who aren't necessarily in leadership roles. So that was a question. Is the concept of followership something that the panelists are considering or have considered in terms of, I guess, the context of leading through uncertainty?
Thanks, Russell. And Dean, I guess, Rhys, thanks for joining us. I think that could be Rhys Bacon. So welcome, Rhys.
Right.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, Dean, thank you.
Rhys Bacon from Buck. Rhys, great question. And Rhys, while I'm not familiar with that specific article, you did say it's little known, but you know, what comes to mind for me when you call out followership is, you know, Bill, this kind of goes to something you were saying about, you know, the style of leadership where you just like demand followers and you demand those people to do what you tell them to do is just, that's such a dated and useless effort anymore. And it speaks to the notion that the followers or whatever people were referring to as followers, these are smart people that have values and they're discerning. So you will not have followers unless you're actually exhibiting behavior that is worth following. And the followers have smart minds to be able to discern that. And so you simply will not have followers unless you're living and exhibiting things that are of a level that is worth being followed. So I think it's a relationship between followers and leaders that you can't deny. And the assumption is that all are smart and highly perceptive at operating in what they're doing. So Rhys, I'm not sure if it was totally off of what you were referring to there, but that was sort of what came to mind for me when you raised that question of followers.
Thanks, Dean. Marjorie, do you have anything to add on followership?
I absolutely agree. I think that a leader who's on their own is simply just on a journey that doesn't inspire anything. The idea of followers, so to speak, I'm not sure I like the term so much, but I like what it implies, is that you have people who are motivated and inspired by the common goal and the vision that you're painting. And so absolutely, if you don't have people that are interested in the journey that you're trying to walk, then you're a solo walker, essentially.
Indeed. Dean, coming back to this, and it's a great segue into this second part of the webinar, really, I had written down a line from Bill's article that you quoted earlier, Bill, which is, how can you tell a leader apart from the others they have followers? Simple. Now, Dean, Russell and I both know that you have followers, you know, inside and outside of Buck. We know that you've come through, you know, a period of uncertainty over the past several months, during which, you know, Buck has been acquired by Gallagher. How did you lead your followers through that period of uncertainty to where you are today?
Well, Thomas, first of all, you know, thank you for suggesting that I've led effectively. However, I want to make clear, you know, I've certainly learned as much from failing and not leading well as I have from learning from others who have. So I think though what I've come to learn is that you know, having an intentional framework for leadership is so important. Leadership just doesn't happen by accident. Sure, you may have someone that might have some natural leadership abilities. However, you know, when you have a difficult transition to go through, or you have a big change to go through, you have all this global uncertainty that we're talking about. If leaders out there really want to be serious about doing their best to lead their teams or their people through it, having an intentional framework that you go to that will help you lead through that is critical. And I know certainly Leading Figures has done so much to help establish such frameworks. And I know the Cousys and Posner framework is one that you all have helped the Buck organization learn about. And I've seen that be employed very effectively by so many different leaders at Buck now. So, you know, things like modeling the way, things like challenging the process. Marjorie, you mentioned how when you see things that aren't as they should be, maybe it's around fairness or justice. Part of leadership is challenging that process, and part of leadership is doing what you've done, Marjorie, and say this isn't the way it should be. So having those pieces of the framework there, so that you know when you need to step up and do something, is just so important. So so that's what I would say. Have a proven and trusted framework to count on.
Thanks ever so much, Dean. And of course, you mentioned that framework within it is inspiring a shared vision. Marjorie, you mentioned earlier that the leader who walks alone doesn't necessarily inspire. Are you able to share, because we know that this is something that many people do struggle with, how do you inspire a shared vision? How would you advise our listeners, our guests today to inspire others?
Gosh, Thomas, it's a really tough question.
Just to give you time to think about that, it would be fair to say that in and of yourself and what you've achieved, as with Dean, as with Bill, you have inspired through who you are. I hope that's given you some time to think.
Excuse me. In some ways, I would say yes. So I do get people saying that they're inspired by being able to see somebody break barriers and succeed. It's not something I particularly occupy myself with. I think inspiring through a shared vision is getting people on board. So being able to take ideas from others, to recognize that the way that you see the world isn't necessarily the way that isn't necessarily the optimal way of seeing the world, that there are other perspectives you can take into account. And that vision needs to be shared. So it can't be Marjorie drawn and a hand-me-down, here, everybody drink this Kool-Aid and let's carry on. So I do like a collaborative way forward. I'm very mindful that I have certain strengths and others have those that I don't possess. And so I enjoy the exercise of building a vision together and then getting buy-in. My big thing is about understanding what the milestones are along a particular journey. So let's say we're on a strategy building exercise, that it's very clear what that's going to look like in 12 months from now, in 3 years from now, what the outcomes are, who's responsible for what. So it's very concrete. Yeah, just a little bit about my experience.
Thanks, Marjorie. Bill, coming back to your point earlier about the distinction between the transactional and the relational, I guess what Dean and Marjorie have been talking about, there are points of difference that are relational. Would you like to elaborate on that distinction?
Yeah, they are. And I hope that the transactional model is something that historians will look back on and say, well, there was a period of time where that was absolutely the dominant model. I think, though, the authentic nature of a leader is important, because you can't have relationship management if you do not have authenticity, because who are you having the relationship with? I also think you have to be transparent. How can you not be open with colleagues and share information if you're expecting them to input to the direction of travel? And I do think in the old model, holding power or holding information or whatever it may have been was a way of leaders controlling the narrative. But how can you expect your intelligent, smart people who are following you to participate if you're not giving them all of the information? They're not children. I have heard businesses say to me, oh, we can't tell people that because that might frighten them, it might unsettle them, or whatever it may be. It's almost a sort of parent type relationship. And I think those days have long gone. I think also relationship leaders accept challenge, because relationships have to be a two-way street. Otherwise, it's just transmit. And as the individual that Marjorie described earlier, if you're leading and you don't have any followers, well, you're on a walk on your own. So I think where I see it failing mostly in the world is in the political sphere. where the ability to change your mind, I think, is a strength, given that you're taking on new information and new data, and new opinions. For politicians, though, changing their mind is referred to as a U-turn, and that's always considered to be something dreadful. So they tend to then double down on things, which I find is just incredibly dumb. So I think the ability in your relationship management to have a strength to admit that you don't know. So when I'm going into a new business for the first time, the people I'm meeting know infinitely more about the business than I do. So wouldn't it be the most ridiculous and hubristic thing for me to think I had any answers for them at that point in time? So when Galbraith, the famous economist, was challenged because he had changed his mind, and he said to the journalist, "Young man, when presented with new information, I change my mind. What do you do?" So I think that it's really important that the authentic leader is prepared to say, "That's wrong. I don't understand this. I don't know the answer." And I'm very often the person in the room who will ask what I would describe as the silly boy question. And then a whole raft of other people say, "Oh, I didn't know what that meant either." So I think you have to be prepared to say, "I don't know," even if you're considered to be a leader. I think the best leaders are the ones who are prepared to take on board views and opinions from those who might be considerably more expert than they are.
Well said, Bill. And actually, you've reminded me there that Patrick Lencioni's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, does highlight, the vulnerability of the leader actually being a great strength, which does, for some people, sound counterintuitive. I wonder, Russell, if we could have a look at questions. I see there's a few.
There's a few great questions. In fact, I also got an email just beforehand with a question similar to one made here, which is basically, through periods of uncertainty, our emotions can be challenged. And Bill, you were talking about increasing profit. We need to increase productivity. Marjorie, you're talking about uncertainty, etc., having an impact on mental health. How do we basically, as leaders, seek to improve productivity without having a detrimental impact upon people's mental health, which has been suffering, I guess, to some extent through COVID and the virtual world that we've been operating in?
Is that question directed to anyone in particular, Russell?
No, whoever.
Right, thanks. Dina or Marjorie, Dina or Marjorie, yeah.
I'm happy to make a start and have Dean contribute. I think being very clear about what productivity means is helpful. So many organizations like to deem presenteeism productivity. Just showing your face in the office does not mean you're getting work done. So if we're clear what the outcomes are that we're looking for, then we can be flexible about how the work gets done as long as it gets done. And I think that different people work in different ways, thrive in different environments. Some people like to be at their home office working all day long without interruption, and others enjoy social interaction. So allowing the flexibility for people to thrive in their own environments is helpful. And then secondly, creating avenues for people to flag when they are experiencing some kind of strain and creating the support systems that they might need and potentially may not have access to.
Thank you, Marjorie. Dean?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's clear evidence in the HR space that working less can absolutely yield better productivity. We see the evidence, and there was a big experimental studies with the 4-day work week that have been happening recently that are very popular and are proving that productivity still can occur then. Something that we have done at our own company is have, as part of Mental Health Awareness Month and mental health efforts, we've had 0 meeting weeks where we say no internal meetings can be set up at all. So everyone can just work with a clear head. We've given extra days off in the spirit of mental health. And lo and behold, we end up with better productivity. So I think there's a lot to be considered there by employers to look at mandating less time presenteeism, and you actually get a higher return on that productivity. So both can be solved. Maybe the best of both worlds can be found in a balance there.
Thanks, Dean and Marjorie both. Bill, do you want to add to that?
I think employers and leaders can't be too prescriptive. During lockdown, when in the UK, one particular business based in London with predominantly London-centric staff, we had surveys every week about how people were. And we had younger members of staff who were perhaps living in smaller accommodation in zones 1 and 2 of London, so the central parts of London. And one directly said to us, I'd no longer want to join Zoom calls to look into the open spaces that the seniors have got in their houses in zones 5 and beyond, because I'm sitting on the end of my bed in a bed sit in Shoreditch, and I really don't want to be doing that. So we couldn't be prescriptive about working from home, because for some people it just doesn't work. So we had to be flexible and find near-term accommodation that those individuals could go and work from. And I think any organization that has a sort of blanket, we are all in the office or we're not, I suspect that people will vote with their feet, and they will go and find an employer that chimes with what they want to do. And I think that's the mark of decent leadership, is to recognize that in this world that we live in today, bespoke outcomes are much more important than the Victorian mill owner saying, you start at 9 and you finish at 4 and blah-de-blah. I think that world in the main has gone. We also need to remember that a vast array of lower paid jobs particularly, and it's often what I would describe as the underemployed, those who've got 3, 4, 5 jobs to make ends meet, they do have jobs that demand presenteeism. You know, they've got to be somewhere to deliver the skill that they're delivering. So I think we have to be quite careful about all of that. But as an adjunct to that, from an economic perspective, if you look at Manhattan, you look at London, probably the big cities of the world, there is a corporate commercial real estate whirlwind coming as a sort of 2 to 3 year backflow of a lot of what we faced during the course of the pandemic. And I think we've yet to see that real estate impact coming, but it certainly is.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you. Just conscious of time, I wonder if we could do a fairly quick roundup. Marjorie, coming back to yourself, what do you think are the key skills for leading through uncertainty? Or alternatively, what books have you drawn on? Could you recommend one that, you know, our guests could maybe refer to that, you know, has inspired you?
Thanks, Thomas. So skills-wise, I would say a number of things come to mind. Curiosity, being open to learning, building interpersonal relationships, being open-minded about options that are available and external perspectives, and then just having the knowledge that one can pivot if plan A needs to become plan K, and having the courage to take those big leaps of faith. In terms of books, nothing particularly coming to mind on that topic, but a book that I would highly recommend for topics that we've discussed through this webinar is The Courage to Be Disliked, written by 2 Japanese authors, and really, really interesting and fascinating. Highly recommend.
Thanks, Marjorie. Thank you. And Dean?
Yeah.
Skills and books. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say the one skill I'd like to call out that hasn't been mentioned yet is just the power of optimism. I feel that the power of optimism is overlooked, and it's more powerful than you might imagine. Has such a ripple effect. Quick example: someone on my team just recently, with all of our changes, we're going into being acquired by a new company now. She called me and specifically asked for, hey, on our upcoming team call, can you be sure to bring that optimism, because we just need it, and if you exhibit it, then it's going to have an impact on everyone. So just being optimistic as a leader can really positively influence your whole team.
Oh, Dean, thanks for injecting that optimism here, just, you know, at the 11th hour of this call. Much appreciated. Bill, your final thoughts on uncertainty, any key skills, any other books that you might recommend?
Nothing new in uncertainty, Thomas. I'm reminded in 1759, so if you go back to 1759, the United States of America wasn't the United States of America at that point in time. There was a little-known moral philosopher called Adam Smith, was writing something called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was the first major work that he had published, and quite often plays second fiddle to what everybody refers to as the wealth of nations. He said, and I take great heart from it, how selfish soever humankind may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in their nature which interest them in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to them, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So there is a human function there that we like to see others flourish. We like to see others being happy and doing well. And I think if, as leaders, we encourage and coach and cajole our people
Sorry,
to
Bill,
achieve
I think
those
we've lost you there, Bill, momentarily for a few seconds.
as leaders, surely that is enough return for us.
Indeed, indeed.
I won't go
Thanks.
is a book that I would return to.
Thanks ever so much, Bill. One point that I do want to end on personally is that just before this webinar, I did go on to OpenAI and had a conversation with ChatGPT, because in Bill's article he does raise artificial intelligence, and I did ask ChatGPT what are the top 5 ways to lead through a world of uncertainty, and actually it gave me quite a lot. So I wrote back and said, you'd be a little bit more succinct, and I think I rattled it. You know, I'm sure I did, because it came back and said, sure, exclamation mark. Here are 5 succinct ways to lead through a world of uncertainty. And these are the 5. Number 1, communicate effectively. Number 2, stay flexible. Number 3, foster collaboration. Number 4, focus on what you can control. And number 5, prioritize self-care by modeling healthy behaviors for your team. So there you go, advice from ChatGPT. And with that said, hand back to Russell to close out the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. So, thank you very much, our great panelists, for contributing to that debate. It was really enjoyable. Apologies to Mark and Chris, we haven't got round to your questions. But just to say that a recording of this webinar and a copy of Bill's article is in the Insights section of our website. So if you just go to our homepage, click on Insights, you'll find both there. Thank you again. And I'll just leave you with one insight I got from listening to a lady who worked at the Salvation Army, and her view on life was hope for the best, expect the worst, and take what comes, which I thought was a lovely way of thinking about things. So thank you all again, and take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.